No, I can't do this. Why this?
My family sat me down at my father's dining table and asked me to give away the company I spent 14 years building to my brother, who had never run a business a day in his life. They thought I would say yes. They thought 14 years of my own sweat, my own sacrifice, my own sleepless nights would simply be handed over because they asked nicely, because they used my father's name, because they assumed I would always be the one who folded first in that family. They had no idea what I was about to say next. And by the time I finished speaking that afternoon, nothing in my family would ever look the same again. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand what happened at that dining table, you have to understand who I was before I ever sat down at it. My name is Claire Bennett. 14 years ago, I built a wellness company out of my kitchen table with $4,000 in savings and a recipe for a skincare balm I had been mixing by hand for my own sensitive skin. Today, that company, Willow Grove Wellness, is worth $60 million. It has offices in 3 states, it employs over 200 people, and it has my name attached to every product that leaves our warehouse. 3 months ago, my own family tried to take it from me. Not with lawyers first, not with threats first, but with something far harder to fight, with love disguised as concern, and with a diagnosis I was not ready to hear used as a reason I could not refuse. There are 3 questions I need you to hold on to as this story unfolds, because every answer changes the way you will see the people in it. Why did my family, who had never once asked me for anything related to my business in 14 years, suddenly turn against the one thing I had built entirely on my own? Who was really behind the pressure to sign that transfer? Because I promise you, it was not who I first believed. And what did I already know, sitting at that table, that none of them expected me to know? By the end of this story, you will understand exactly how far people will go when they believe no one is paying attention, including the people who claim to love you the most. I grew up the middle child in a house where my brother Ryan was the son and everyone else simply orbited around him. He was 3 years younger than me, effortlessly likable, the kind of boy who could break a lamp and somehow leave the room smelling like he had fixed it instead. I was the responsible one, the one who was told to be realistic, the one who was praised for good grades but never celebrated the way Ryan was celebrated just for showing up. I loved my brother. I still do. But love and fairness were never the same currency in our house, and by the time I was a teenager, I had already learned not to expect the second one. I left my corporate marketing job when I was 27, after watching a promotion I had earned, one I had trained the man who eventually received it, go to someone else for the 3rd time. I did not quit in anger. I quit quietly on a Tuesday, and I went home and mixed a small batch of a face balm I had been perfecting for 2 years, because my own skin could not tolerate anything on the shelves. I sold my first 12 jars to coworkers who missed me. Within a year, I had a website. Within 3 years, I had my first national retail order. Within 10 years, I had turned down 2 acquisition offers because I refused to hand my name to a company that did not understand why I built it in the first place. I remember the exact night I hired my first employee, a woman named Angela who had answered a classified ad I posted for someone to help pack orders on weekends. I could barely afford to pay her that first month, and I remember sitting in my car outside the bank after depositing her paycheck, doing the math over and over to make sure it would clear. Nobody in my family knew how close to the edge those early years actually were. They only ever saw the finished product later, the neat rows of bottles in a store, the interviews, the number that eventually made its way into family conversation, as though it had simply appeared, rather than having been built one exhausting week at a time. I never once asked my parents for a loan. I never wanted anyone to be able to say that this company existed because someone else had made it easier for me. While I was building Willow Grove from nothing, my brother Ryan was cycling through 3 different ventures: a coffee subscription service, a men's grooming line, and a fitness app, each one funded quietly by my father, each one folding within 18 months, and each failure somehow discussed in our family as bad luck rather than a pattern. I remember visiting Ryan's grooming line's small warehouse once, back when it was still limping along, and noticing shelves half full of unsold inventory, boxes stacked in ways that told me nobody working there had any real experience managing product flow. I did not say anything critical that day. I offered, gently, to introduce him to a supply chain consultant I trusted, someone who had helped me avoid several costly mistakes in my own early years. He thanked me, politely, and never called the number I gave him. Looking back now, I wonder if accepting real help from me would have meant admitting, even quietly to himself, that his sister understood something about building a business that he did not yet understand about his own. I never resented Ryan for trying. I resented the silence that followed every one of his failures, compared to the constant, careful scrutiny that followed every one of my successes, as though a woman building something real was somehow more suspicious than a man losing money over and over again. I remember one particular Thanksgiving when I was 19, home from college with a marketing internship offer I was proud of, an offer I had competed against 40 other students for. I brought it up once at dinner, briefly, before the conversation turned, as it always did, to whatever Ryan was doing that semester. A business plan he had sketched on a napkin for a food truck he never actually built. Nobody asked me a single follow-up question about my internship that entire night. I was not angry about it then. I did not even fully notice it then. It was only years later, once I started building something of my own, that I understood how many small moments like that one had quietly taught me not to expect to be celebrated, only to expect to be useful. My father, Robert Bennett, was 71 years old, and about a year before that dinner, I started to notice small things. He repeated a story about his own father twice in the same conversation. He forgot my assistant's name, a woman he had known for 6 years. He called me by my mother's name once, and laughed it off so quickly that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. I did not have a word for what I was seeing yet. Nobody in my family had said the word out loud, but I remember driving home that night with my hands tight on the wheel, feeling for the first time that something in our family's foundation had quietly begun to shift, long before any of us were ready to admit it. The formal diagnosis came 6 months later. Early-stage vascular dementia, the doctor said. Slow-moving for now, unpredictable in its pace, but real. My mother, Linda Bennett, took the news the way she took most difficult things, by immediately reorganizing everything around her instead of sitting still with the grief. Within weeks, she was talking about legacy, about stability, about what my father would have wanted for the family name. I did not think much of it at the time. I assumed it was simply how she processed fear. I had no idea that this particular fear of hers went back decades, to a story she had never once told me, and that it was about to be used as the justification for everything that followed. The invitation came on a Sunday evening, a text from my mother that read nothing like her usual messages. It simply said, "We need the whole family together this week. It is important. Please clear your schedule." When I called to ask what it was about, her voice had a strange formality to it, the tone she used for funerals and church committees, not family dinners. Ryan texted me separately an hour later, 4 words that I would replay in my head for weeks afterward. "We need to talk. About Dad." I remember sitting in my office staring at that message, assuming, hoping, that we were finally going to talk honestly about his diagnosis, about care plans, about the future. I was wrong. We were about to talk about my company. I arrived at my parents' house that Thursday evening and knew before I even opened the car door that something was wrong. There were too many cars in the driveway for a simple family dinner. My father's car was there, my mother's, Ryan's, and one more I did not recognize. A black sedan parked at the curb like it did not belong to the neighborhood. I walked in to find the dining table already set. Not with dinner, but with a single manila folder placed precisely in the center of it, the way you set a stage before an audience arrives. Ryan would not meet my eyes when I sat down. My mother's hands were folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. My father smiled at me the way he always did, warm and a little distant, and I remember thinking, for one brief, foolish moment, that maybe everything was going to be fine. My mother spoke first, and she spoke like she had rehearsed it, which, I would later learn, she had. She said your father built this family's name, and none of us can bear the thought of it disappearing because of circumstances beyond our control. She said Ryan is family, and family should carry what we've built forward. She said this is what your father would have wanted, before any of this happened to him. I sat there listening, and somewhere underneath the shock, a small, sharp part of my mind noted that my last name was already on every product Willow Grove had ever sold. I had never changed it. I had never needed anyone to remind me who I was. Then my mother slid that manila folder across the table toward me, and inside it was a legal document, already drafted, already formatted with my company's information filled in with a precision that told me this had taken real time and real money to prepare. It was an ownership transfer agreement, assigning majority control of Willow Grove Wellness from me to my brother Ryan, with a blank signature line waiting exactly where mine was supposed to go. I remember the sound of the paper more than I remember my own thoughts in that moment. That soft, deliberate slide across polished wood, like they had done this before, like they knew exactly how this scene was supposed to play out. I looked around that table at the people who had known me my entire life and asked, as calmly as I could manage, why now? Why this particular week? Why a document that had clearly taken weeks to draft, rather than a conversation that had only occurred to them that morning? Nobody answered the question directly. My mother instead repeated the word family 3 more times in the span of a single minute, as though repetition alone could fill the space where an actual answer should have been. I noticed that too, the way people talk in circles when the center of the circle is something they are not willing to name out loud. Ryan spoke for the first time that evening, and something about the way he said it caught in my chest before I could name why. He said, "We need this settled by the end of the month, Claire. It is important for the transition to happen cleanly." He did not say why the end of the month mattered. He did not say what transition he meant. But there was a specificity in his urgency that did not match a family simply worried about legacy, and I remember filing that detail away. The way you notice a single crack in a wall you are not yet ready to examine closely. I did not sign anything that night. I asked for time, which in that house was apparently the same as refusing outright. The temperature in the room changed instantly. My mother's face closed like a door. My father looked confused, glancing between us as though trying to catch up to a conversation that had moved faster than he could follow. And something about that confusion broke my heart more than anything else in that room. As I stood to leave, my mother said one last thing to me at the door, quiet enough that only I could hear it. She said, "I hope you can live with what this does to this family." I drove home that night with my hands shaking, not because I feared losing the company, but because I finally understood that someone in that room was not simply trying to convince me. Someone was trying to control me, and I intended to find out exactly who. For the first week after that dinner, I assumed my mother was the architect of everything, driven purely by an old-fashioned belief that a business belonged in a man's hands to be taken seriously. I started digging into our family's history, not out of anger, but because something about her desperation felt older than this moment, older than my father's diagnosis. What I found stopped me completely. In 1987, my mother's own father had built a small hardware business from nothing, much like I had built mine, and under pressure from his brothers, convinced that a woman married into the family had no business inheriting it, he had signed his share of the company over to his younger brother. Within 2 years, that business had collapsed entirely, and my mother, then a young woman watching her father's life work disappear, had never spoken about it to anyone in our family, not once, in nearly 40 years. I found an old newspaper clipping while I was digging, a small local business announcement from a regional paper, listing the hardware store's closing sale after less than 2 years under its new ownership. I stared at that clipping for a long time, doing the math in my head, realizing my mother would have been only a few years older than I was now when she watched it happen. She had never told me this story growing up. Not once. In all the years I complained about being overlooked in favor of Ryan, had she ever offered this piece of herself as an explanation, an apology, or even a warning. I began to understand that her silence about her own past was not an absence of feeling, it was the opposite, a wound so old and so carefully buried that she had built an entire set of beliefs on top of it without ever once looking directly at where those beliefs had actually come from. While I was learning the shape of my mother's old wound, I was also learning something far more urgent about my brother. I hired a forensic accountant quietly, a woman recommended by a colleague I trusted completely, and asked her to look into any financial connections tied to Ryan's recent ventures. What she found within days made my stomach turn. There were repeated wire transfers over the past 3 years, totaling just over $2,300,000, all originating from the same source, a private equity operator named Preston Hale. I had never heard the name before that week. I would not be able to forget it for the rest of my life. Preston Hale, it turned out, ran a small but aggressive investment fund that specialized in what his own marketing materials euphemistically called family succession opportunities. A polite way of describing exactly what he had been engineering inside my family for months. He had quietly loaned Ryan money across each of his failed ventures. Money my parents believed had come from Ryan's own savings or from bank loans. Money that had, in reality, kept my brother financially tethered to a man whose entire business model depended on stepping into families at their most fragile moments and offering rescue in exchange for control. I spent an entire weekend reading through everything public I could find about Hale's fund, old interviews, a profile in a regional business journal from several years earlier, a handful of lawsuits that had quietly settled out of court with former business owners who had once trusted him. A pattern started to take shape the longer I looked. Always a family business. Always an aging or ailing parent somewhere in the picture. Always a younger, less established sibling positioned as the more convenient face for a deal that ultimately benefited Hale far more than it ever benefited the family itself. I remember sitting at my kitchen table at nearly 2 a.m, the same table where I had once mixed my very first batch of that skincare balm, realizing that my own family's grief had been identified, somewhere along the way, as an opportunity. For a brief, painful window, I actually believed Ryan might be a victim in all of this too. Just like the rest of us. A man in over his head who had been approached and exploited the same way our father's illness was being exploited. I found evidence of a phone call between Hale and my father from months earlier, a conversation my father likely did not fully understand given where his mind already was by then, and for one long night I genuinely felt sorry for my brother, certain he had been manipulated into a corner he did not know how to escape. I was about to learn exactly how wrong that sympathy was. I even called Ryan that week, before I had the full picture, and asked him carefully, gently, whether Preston Hale had ever pressured him into anything he was not comfortable with. He paused just a beat too long before answering, then told me Hale was simply an old contact from business school who occasionally gave him advice. It was such a small lie, so easy to tell, so easy for me to almost believe, and it was that phone call, more than anything else, that told me I needed proof, not conversations, before I brought any of this to the rest of my family. People who are telling the truth rarely need that extra half second to decide which version of the story to give you. Buried in an email thread my accountant traced back through Ryan's business account was a term sheet, already drafted, already discussed, in which Ryan had verbally agreed to sell 40% of Willow Grove Wellness to Preston Hale's fund the moment ownership legally transferred into his name. This was never about our father's legacy. This was never even about family tradition. It was a quiet, calculated payoff. My company traded away to settle a debt my own brother had spent 3 years hiding from every single one of us, dressed up as an act of love for a dying man's wishes. I sat with that discovery for a long time before I did anything with it. I read the term sheet again and again, looking for some explanation that would make it mean something other than what it so plainly said, some version of events where my brother had been tricked rather than complicit. I thought about every family dinner over the past 3 years where Ryan had smiled and said things were finally coming together for him. Every time my mother had beamed with relief that her son was finally finding his footing. Every one of those moments now recolored by the knowledge of what had actually been happening underneath them. I did not confront anyone that night. I sat alone in my office long after everyone else had gone home, and for the first time since that folder had slid across the table, I allowed myself to grieve, not for the company, but for the version of my brother I had believed in for so long. I did not confront my family with what I had found right away. Instead, I did something I should have done the moment that folder slid across the table. I went to see my father alone, without telling my mother or Ryan, on an afternoon his nurse told me tended to be one of his clearer ones. What he told me that day, sitting in his favorite chair by the window with the afternoon light across his face, changed everything I thought I understood. Not just about this fight over my company, but about my entire family, and about myself. My father was sharper that afternoon than I had seen him in months, and somewhere in the middle of our conversation about nothing in particular, he mentioned, almost offhandedly, the trust. I asked him what trust he meant, and for a moment his eyes cleared in a way that made my chest ache. He told me that years ago, when I first started Willow Grove, he had quietly invested a small amount, an amount I had never known about because he had never wanted credit for it, and that he had placed his resulting shares, 12% of my own company, into an irrevocable trust years later, naming me as the sole trustee, long before his diagnosis, long before any of this began. He told me he had never said any of this out loud because he did not want Ryan to feel like less of a son, that he had spent years quietly believing in what I was building without ever wanting his belief to look like a comparison. He said legacy was never about whose name sounded strongest on a door. It was about who built something that could actually last. I sat with him for a long time after that, holding his hand, understanding for the first time that the man across the table from me that night, the one being used as the reason for my family's demands, had already, years earlier, quietly chosen who he trusted with everything he had built. Before I left that afternoon, he said one more thing that I have carried with me every day since. He told me he was not afraid of what was coming for his mind, not really, because he trusted that I would take care of the things that mattered once he no longer could. He said it so simply, without any weight behind it at all, the way you might mention the weather, and it was that simplicity that broke something open in me on the drive home. I had spent so many years believing I needed to prove I deserved to be trusted. I had never once considered that he had already decided, quietly, on his own, long before I ever needed to prove anything at all. With the trust documents finally in my hands, I went to see my mother, not to accuse her, but because I finally understood enough to ask her the right questions instead of the angry ones. She broke down almost immediately, admitting through tears that she had pushed so hard, had allowed herself to be convinced so completely, because she was terrified of watching her daughter lose everything the same way she had once watched her own father lose everything, decades earlier, in a story she had buried so deeply that even she had almost forgotten how much it still controlled her. She was not trying to destroy me. She was trying, in the only broken way she knew how, to outrun a version of her own past. I spent the following days organizing everything into a single folder of my own, printing each document, arranging them in the order I intended to lay them out, rehearsing in my empty living room exactly how I wanted to say each sentence out loud. I did not want anger to carry that conversation. I had watched anger fail to move my family my entire life, and I understood that the only thing that stood a real chance of reaching them was the plain, undeniable weight of the truth, presented calmly enough that nobody in that room could dismiss it as an overreaction. The night before the meeting, I sat outside my parents' house in my car for nearly 20 minutes before going in, not out of fear, but because I wanted to be completely certain that when I walked through that door, I would be steady. I spent the following days preparing for the meeting Ryan and my mother had already scheduled to formally finalize the transfer, and this time I walked into that same dining room carrying something entirely different than I had carried the first time. I had my father's trust documents. I had Preston Hale's own term sheet, in writing, proving exactly what my brother had agreed to. I had a full accounting of the $2,300,000 that had quietly bought my brother's loyalty to a stranger over his own sister. This time, I was not the one walking into that room unprepared, and they had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them. I sat down at that same table, in the same chair, and when my mother once again pushed the folder toward me, I did not push it back in anger. I simply opened it, calmly, and began laying out everything on top of it, one document at a time. I told them about the trust my father had created years earlier, naming me the sole trustee of his shares. I told them about Preston Hale and the $2,300,000 in loans that had bought my brother's silence and his signature before either had ever even been mentioned to me. They expected tears or a shouting match or, at the very least, a reluctant signature. What they got instead was the truth, laid out piece by piece on the exact table where they had once tried to take everything I had built away from me. Ryan broke first, his composure collapsing entirely as he admitted everything. The debt, the deal already made with Hale, the months of pretending this had ever been about our father's wishes, rather than his own desperation to make a mistake disappear. My mother sat frozen beside him, not angry at me, but devastated at what her own fear had nearly caused inside her own family. I did not raise my voice once. I did not need to. I told them plainly that I would be keeping full control of my company, that Preston Hale would never see a single share of what I had built, and that I intended to make sure his particular brand of quiet manipulation was reported to people who could make sure he never did this to another family again. But I also told my brother something I meant with everything I had left in me that night. I told him I was forgiving his debt to me, not the debt to Hale, that was his to untangle on his own, but the wall his silence had built between us. I offered him a real position inside Willow Grove, not a handout, not ownership he had not earned, but an actual role, entry-level, supervised, the same way anyone else would have to start, if he genuinely wanted to rebuild something between us that was worth more than a signature on a page. I did not do it to save him. I did it because some part of me still remembered the little boy who used to fall asleep on my bedroom floor during thunderstorms, and I was not willing to let a stranger's greed be the reason I lost my brother completely. I also made a call the following week to an attorney who specialized in predatory lending practices, and laid out everything my accountant had found about Preston Hale's pattern with other families. I was told it would likely take months, possibly longer, before anything formal came of it, but I wanted it on record somewhere outside of my own kitchen table, somewhere that could not simply be denied later. I never heard from Hale directly again after that week. I did hear, secondhand, months later, that his fund had quietly stopped taking new family succession clients in our state, and I have chosen to believe that had something to do with the file I helped build. In the months that followed, things did not become perfect, because real families rarely do, but they became honest, which mattered more. My father's condition continued its slow, difficult progression, and I made sure every remaining clear day we had together was spent exactly the way he wanted, without contracts, without pressure, without anyone asking him for anything at all. My mother and I are still rebuilding, carefully, the way you rebuild anything that has been cracked at its foundation. And for the first time in my life, she has started telling me the truth about her own past instead of hiding behind old fears dressed up as tradition. She told me recently, over coffee at her kitchen table, that she had spent nearly 40 years believing that if she just controlled the outcome tightly enough, she could keep her own family from repeating history. She said, watching me lay that truth out so calmly, without ever needing to raise my voice to be believed, was the first time she truly understood the difference between the daughter she had been protecting and the daughter who had actually never needed that kind of protecting in the first place. Ryan started at Willow Grove 3 months ago, in a small operations role, showing up on time, doing the work, slowly, quietly earning something he had never had to earn before. There was an afternoon, a few weeks into his new position, when I walked past the warehouse floor and saw him kneeling beside a pallet, counting inventory by hand alongside 2 employees who had no idea he was my brother, laughing about something none of us could hear from where I stood. I did not say anything to him that day. I simply stood there for a moment longer than I needed to, allowing myself, for the first time in a long while, to feel something close to hope instead of vigilance when it came to him. I renamed our company's new mentorship fund after my father this spring, a program built to help other women starting exactly where I once started, at a kitchen table with almost nothing but an idea and the refusal to give up on it. We funded our first 6 recipients last month, women in different states, different industries, each of them reminding me a little of myself at 27, tired of being overlooked, and finally ready to bet on themselves instead of waiting for someone else to do it first. I brought my father to the small announcement event we held for it, on one of his better days, and though I am not certain how much of it he fully understood by then, he held my hand through the entire thing, and that, more than any signature or any document, felt like the only legacy that had ever actually mattered. I used to believe that loyalty to my family meant giving them whatever they asked of me, no matter the cost to myself. I understand now that real loyalty means telling the people you love the truth, even when the truth is harder to hold than the silence would have been, and even when it costs you the version of peace that only ever existed on the surface. I still think about that first night often, the folder sliding across the table, the blank line waiting for my signature, the certainty in the room that I would simply give in the way I always had before. I want to ask you something before we close this story out tonight. If your own family sat you down and asked you to give away something you had built with your own 2 hands, using someone you loved as the reason you could not say no, Would you have signed that paper to keep the peace, or would you have done exactly what I did? Tell me honestly in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and I would genuinely love to know where you stand. If this story hit close to home for you, wait until you hear the one coming next. About a woman whose in-laws tried to quietly write her out of a will she did not even know existed until it was almost too late. That story is even harder to believe than this one, and it is coming very soon. If you are new to this channel, this is where we tell real stories about family, money, and the moments that reveal exactly who people become when they think no one else is watching. Subscribe now so you never miss what comes next, and I will see you in the next story.